Okay, so now let's start configuring our bot. Before you start, please make sure that you have saved the 2 Excel files in the project folder as I did here, the invoice data and the master invoice. Okay, so as we discussed before, our first activity should be getting the data table from the invoice data, right? So as you learned before, we can use the read range. And here you can use either the read range from the workbook or read range from the Excel. Here it doesn't matter. I will just use the read range from the workbook. Let's give it a name of get invoice data. And we're going to get the data from the Excel file invoice data.xlsx. So let's first open. Okay, so let's first open the Excel file. Okay, let me put it here. So here, one thing to notice that the default name of the sheet is sheet 1, but here the sheet name is actually invoices to bill. So first of all, we need to change the name of the data sheet, invoice to bill. Okay. And also, we want to get the entire table, so we want to leave this as empty. And also, make sure that you immediately create a variable to store the data table. Let me name it as invoice data. Okay, so now our first activity is completed. From here on, we need to create the loop so that we can iterate through each customer. So as we discussed before, we should use a for each row, right? Because we are iterating through this data table. So let's use a for each row. And let's create a name of create an invoice for each customer. Here we're iterating through the invoice data table that we created. So let's use this invoice data here. And in the body, that's where we do the actual iteration, right? So here, remember what I said before. This is where we get the values for each customer and then fill in the invoice for each customer and eventually save the invoice, right? So let's first do the activity of getting the values. So I'm gonna use a bunch of assign activities. So the idea here is that I want to use assign. So let me illustrate here. For example, I want to get the invoice number, right? So here I'm gonna create a new variable called invoice number and assign it with the value of that invoice number. So here, as we are iterating through the table and the invoice number is stored in column number 1, right? So it means that we need to assign it as row 0 to string. So we're using 0 because in UiPath and in many programming languages, they are 0-based indexing, which means your first item is represented as 0. So here, the invoice number, it's stored in column 1, right? So here we use 0 instead of 1. You guys need to go ahead and create variables for each column and assign the corresponding value to that variable. So in the end, you will have a long list of assigned, because here we have 12 variables, right? That will look very ugly. So what I'm going to do is that I want to put all these assigned activities inside another sequence. So I'm gonna use another sequence here, and I will give it a name as sequence of assign values or get values, whatever works for you. And I'm gonna move these assign activities within the sequence. So if you want to make everything more clear, you can change the name of the assign, but I'm not going to illustrate here. So now you can pause the video and go ahead and complete all the other assign activities. Okay, so now I completed my assign activities. I don't think you guys enjoy this process. Neither do I. But after that, you will see, you have 12 assigned activities. And so you may ask, instead of using the numbers to represent what rows to get, can we use the column number? Yes. So if you know what column number what values you are extracting from which column, you can use the column number. For example, I know that the invoice number is from the invoice number column, right? So instead of using row 0, I can use row and then invoice number. Okay, so then you may ask, when should I use the indexing and when should I use the column name? It depends on what situation you are in. So if on the spreadsheet you have, for example, you need to deal with many different invoice data spreadsheet, and on each workbook you have invoice number sitting in different columns. So in that case, they may not always be in the first column or the second column, right? So then the only way to locate that column is by using the name of that column. So if that's the situation, then using the column name is better. And also, you should use the column name instead of indexing when you think it's easier for you to see what has been extracted, right? Because just by looking at these numbers, you do not know which row, which column are you working on, right? So in that case, you can also choose to use the column name. But if you want to use simple, like to make it simple, you can just use the indexing. Okay, so here, if we put all the assigned activities within the sequence, it will be easier for us to view because you can collapse the sequence. So then all the 12 assigned activities will be contained in this box. All right, so now after we get these values, the next step is to use these values to fill in the template, right? So now let me open the template. Okay, so here because we are going to write the values within predefined cells. For example, the invoice number will always go into cell C1, and date will always go into cell C3, and name is C9, C10, and C11, 12, so on and so forth, right? So we're going to use the activity of write cell, right? So if we search write cell, we get two options, right? One is from the workbook, one is from the Excel. Theoretically, you can use either, but in this case, I prefer to use the write cell from the Excel automation. I will show you the reason later on. So to use the write cell from the Excel, we need to enclose it within the container of Excel application scope. So you should find the activity called Excel application scope, because any Excel activities should be contained within that scope. After you find that, you can go ahead and insert this right cell activity from Excel within the scope. Okay, so now I want to explain why in this case the right cell from the Excel automation makes more sense or can make our life easier. So if you use the right cell from the workbook here, let me just pull it here. You notice that for each right cell coming from the workbook automation, you need to provide the workbook path, right? But for the right cell coming from the Excel automation, you do not need to, because these activities are contained within the application scope. So you do not need to provide that path again and again, because it's already contained in the scope of the workbook that you want to work with. So I think it makes more sense. Besides, when using the Excel application scope, you can visually view what's going on the Excel workbook, like what I showed you before when I run the bot, right? You can see that different cells have been populated by the bot, so you can have that visualization. And this is somehow important to accountants or auditors, because they always want to have some kind of assurance of what's going on there, instead of thinking RPA as a black box. So in this aspect, it's also good to use Excel application scope to give people a visualization of what's going on. Okay, so now let's go ahead. Obviously, we want to open the template, right? And the template name is called master invoice.xlsx. And so let's give it a name as fill in the template. Okay, so let's first stop here and think about, okay, after we use all the right cells and populate all these fields, the next step would be save that invoice with the invoice number at the end, right? So that means it's somehow like a save as function, right? Have you guys used the save as? I bet, of course, right? But here in the UI path, if you are going to use save as, you need to use some like VB language, which I don't think it's necessary. So what we're going to do is that let's use some creative way. How about we first make a copy of this master invoice and work on that copy. And when we generate that copy, we directly name it as the way the master invoice followed by the invoice number. So let me show you how is that possible. So to make a copy of the file, it's actually that activity is one of the things that you can choose here. It's called copy file. So let's move it here before the Excel application scope. So the from is the file that you want to make a copy of. Obviously, that's the master invoice Excel, right? So let me just copy it here. And to, that's the file that's the copy, okay? And here we want to name the copy with the invoice number at the end. So here we need to use string concatenation, right? So let's see what we can do here. So, okay, we want some invoice numbers at the end, and so we need to, let me just use this to separate the master invoice and the invoice number. So obviously we want something in the middle, right? We want the invoice number in the middle. And did we do that there, the invoice number? Yes, we created that variable, right, called invoice number while you do the assign activities. So that's the first assign activity we did. So I'm gonna type invoice number here. Okay, so in this way, we make a copy of the master invoice, and we rename the copy using the required way. Okay, because we want to put the invoice number at the end. You can choose to override because you may run the bot again and again to troubleshoot. So the override will make sure that even though that copy is there, it will just create a new one to override it. So here I can make a description as make a copy of the invoice. Okay. And here I want to make a note that if you cannot find invoice number in your while you type in the variable name, you need to double check the scope of the variable scope. So let's go back to the sequence again, so you first click on the sequence box and go to the variables. You will see that you have these are the variables we created within that sequence scope, right? However, now we are going to use the variables in the following, in the other scopes. So, okay, let me illustrate. So, for example, if I want to use the variable of customer name, okay, so if I want to insert something, use customer name, I cannot find it, right? That's because the customer name, the variable, is only within the scope of this box. So to make the variables flow across these boxes, we need to change the scope. So the reason why the invoice number, I can put it here, is that the scope was already in the body, I guess. Yes, it's in the body. Okay, so here let's change the scope into body so that the variable can be used within the box of the body, which contains all the other scopes. Okay, so now you can go ahead and change the scope. Okay, so these are the variables and their scope here. Now let's go ahead and fill in the template. So here, instead of populating the value into our original copy, the master invoice, we want to populate into our new invoice template, right, with the invoice number at the end. And here, let's also pay attention to the sheet name, and actually the name should be invoice rather than the default sheet 1, right? So let's use invoice. Let's do let's follow the consequence of let's follow the sequence of all these values. So let's do invoice number first, and we should put it in cell C1. So let's use C1. And the value should be invoice number, right? If you want, you can also change the name of the right cell into